Welcome to my tales of the paranormal. Hello there, folks. Leprechaun coming at ya. You know, this time of year is a very special time. It's a time when it is believed that the veil between our physical realm here and that of the spiritual realm is at its thinnest. Now, the belief is that this allows spirits to more easily communicate through or even cross through into our realm, our plane of existence, whatever you want to call it. To me, this is exciting. I've always been very interested in the paranormal and spiritual, so I very much enjoy this time of year. Now, just a quick note, I've been playing with ambience and lighting, trying to create the right mood for this particular video. If you feel like this works or doesn't work, please feel free to let me know and suggest any changes. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that this is not a full-time profession for me, and basically I'm doing this on a budget. So I don't have a lot of tools and tech to work with. I kind of have to go with what I got. I will be getting a mic so that my voice can be better picked up to make it easier in the editing process, because I find I have to edit my voice when I do these videos. Now, this video is different from the others I've done. This is not a gaming video. This will not be a video about doing witchcraft, magic, paganism, or anything of that sort. But it is in the supernatural realm. I thought, since we're in the spooky season, and ghosts and things like that are more prevalent on everyone's mind, I would do a video about ghost stories, paranormal experiences. Now, I'm probably going to be doing more than one of these particular videos because I have enough tales to share that they can be split up into multiple videos. So I hope you enjoy, and without further ado, shall we get into these tales? Oh, before I do though, I should tell you that most of what I'm going to tell you is based on actual accounts. There may be one or two stories completely embellished. I do have the gift of gab after all. The first tale. When I was a child, we lived in this big two-story house that we had been renting from a truck driver. Now, he also lived in this house, but as he was an over-the-road driver, he was frequently away from the house for extended periods of time. Sometimes a week, sometimes 2, sometimes a month. It always varied, and we were never sure when he'd be home. He was a very nice man, and he always treated us very well when he was around. For the most part, it was just my mother, my 2 siblings, and I living in this house. Now, we had more than one instance while living in this house. The first that I can recall is when I was young, I can't remember how old, I'd been playing in my room all by myself. My siblings and my mom were downstairs. I knew my mom was in the kitchen. She'd been cleaning up after lunch. I had decided, though, that I wanted a snack. So I left my room and went to head to the stairs. Now, quick side note. The stairs we had would go down to a landing where there was a left turn and a few more steps before getting to the bottom. I believe there was something like 12 or 13 steps going to the landing. 13 doesn't sound right, though, because I remember hearing something about a superstition about having 13 steps in a house. So it could have been more or less. I don't really recall. Anyway, the point is, there were significantly more steps going from the top to the landing than there were from the landing to the bottom. Now, as I walked along and reached the top of the stairs and turned to head down the stairs, I was quite startled by a figure. This figure looked to be a man. The problem was that the man was completely transparent. I could see him, I could see his shape, I could even see a little bit of color, but I could see through him. I could see the wall behind him. I could see the window. I could see what was beyond the window. The man was just standing there, smiling, non-threatening, but as you can imagine, being a child, this was entirely frightening. I completely panicked and did the only thing my fight-or-flight brain could think to do, which, looking back, makes no sense whatsoever, and I'm not sure why I thought this was a good plan. Did I run back to my room, jump into my bed, and pull the covers over my head? No. Did I go hide underneath the bed? No. Did I find a closet to hide in? No. Instead, for whatever reason, I chose to run down the stairs towards the figure and through it. I didn't stop running until I reached the kitchen, which, of course, startled my mother. I told her about what I saw, but she dismissed my story, claiming it was imagination, or perhaps I had been napping and woke up still in a dreamlike state, and that my dream mind had made up the figure. But I knew what I saw, and I knew it was real. I let it go, however. Now, I believe it was maybe a couple weeks later. My sister was walking up the stairs when she saw something slightly in the wall that startled her, and she tripped, and then describes a hand stretched out of the wall. Now, she couldn't quite recall whether the hand was stretched out of the wall already, or as she was tripping, or after she tripped. The details were fuzzy, just that she had seen something slightly hovering, almost like a person. It startled her, and then she saw a hand reach out of the wall. Now, my mother concluded that this must obviously have been a guardian angel that was reaching out to catch her as she fell, and meant her no harm whatsoever. I should tell you that our mother did very much believe that supernatural things were real. Our mother was also very Christian-based in her belief, and often thought that things were the work of God. Anything supernatural that wasn't the work of God was the work of the devil. At any rate, Nothing more came of this particular instance. But this would not be the last spooky thing to happen in that house. One night I had been sick and feverish. My mom decided that it would be a good idea for me to sleep in her room. That way she could keep an eye on me as I slept. Also, she figured it would comfort me, being a young child and sick with fever. She tucked me in and then went back downstairs, leaving me alone in the room. This really didn't bother me. I was not afraid of the dark as a child. I wasn't afraid of things going bump in the night like most children were. Actually, it typically excited me. Well, this particular night, though, I had a dream, a terrible dream. I dreamt that I was downstairs in the kitchen with my family, and our landlord too, all sitting around the kitchen table. I was sitting on my mother's lap, playing with some toys on the table, while she read a book. The landlord was reading the newspaper. My siblings were munching little snacks while playing with their toys. And in my dream, I looked down underneath the table and was startled to see what looked like some sort of swirling dark vortex opening up on the floor beneath the table. I jumped in my dream and alerted to everybody, but no one reacted. It got worse. I saw a figure, dark, black as tar, climbing out of this hole, this vortex, with long, pointy fingers. I can't really recall seeing eyes, but I definitely saw a dark black figure, and it was climbing out, and it was looking towards me with a menacing grin on its face. I began screaming and went to run, but before I could jump off my mom's lap, it grabbed a hold of my ankles and began to pull. I, of course, grabbed onto my mom and onto the table, screaming, kicking, begging someone to help me. But no one seemed to move. It was as if I wasn't even there, as if this event was not taking place. No one even stirred, no one reacted, as this thing was trying to pull me down into this vortex. I was completely terrified, and I knew that if I actually got pulled into this vortex, it was over. I was not going to survive this. Bad, terrible things would happen to me. I had to get away. I had to stay out of that vortex. I remember feeling kind of an icy cold as my feet were dragged down into it, but I held my grip on the table legs tight, and then I woke up. Now, it's not the nightmare itself that is frightening, but rather how I woke up. When I went to sleep, I was all the way at the top of the bed, with my head nearly touching the headboard. This was an old-fashioned king-size bed, with a big headboard at it. When I woke up, my feet were dangling off the foot of the bed. The pillows were strewn towards the foot of the bed. The sheets and the blanket looked as if they had been pulled down. It looked like something had grabbed a hold of my ankles and pulled me towards the foot of the bed, and I had grabbed onto the head of the bed, trying to prevent myself from being dragged down, and I drug everything with me. I was terrified, so I ran downstairs, found my mom in the kitchen, and told her about my experience. Told her about the dream and how I had woke up. She was a little shaken about this, but completely dismissed it, saying that it was simply a nightmare, and that the reason I was hanging off the bed was because I had moved around in my sleep and scooched to the foot of the bed. I asked, what about the blankets and the sheets? Mind you, I was a child, but I knew enough to rationalize that this was not normal. That there was something peculiar about the way the sheets and the blankets had been moved. She said that it was likely just from me thrashing around, but I could see on her face there was concern. She brought me upstairs. We fixed the bed together. She looked around and then brought me back downstairs. That night she let me sleep on the couch until she was ready to go to bed, and then took me up once she was ready, and we went to bed together. Now, as far as I know, there were never any other accounts. Nothing else ever happened in that house. Nothing too peculiar, anyway. But this, of course, would not be the only experience I ever had with ghosts or strange happenings. Some strange occurrences that happened to me, I remember, came when I was in 5th grade. I remember I had gone to school one day, and all day I kept thinking that something just didn't feel right. Something was off. Something about that day just felt bad. I wasn't myself in a bad mood. Nothing terrible happened when I woke, when I dressed for school, on my way to school. But something in my gut said that something bad had happened. I remember later, I was sitting in class, and a secretary popped into the classroom with a look on her face. It was a look of concern, not of fear, not anger, concern. Somehow I just knew it was for me. My teacher went over to the secretary, and I stood up. I didn't even have to wait for them to tell me. I packed my stuff, and my teacher turned around and said, "You need to go to the office." I simply said, "I know," and walked out with the secretary, walked to the office where the principal was waiting for me. I wasn't concerned about being in trouble. I knew I'd done nothing wrong. I knew this was about the bad feeling. I knew someone had died. My principal informed me that I would be getting picked up by my mom, that my grandfather had died. Now, a little bit of background on this. My grandfather was actually my great-grandfather on my mom's side. He and my great-grandmother were very old-fashioned people. They still had a old-fashioned churn to make their ice cream. They still made their bread from scratch. They made everything from scratch. But they always kept one box of Lucky Charms in their cupboard, just for me, because it was my favorite cereal when I was a child. I know. Cliché. When we would go over, I would sit on my grandfather's lap and tell him stories and tales. He called me his little chatterbox. I would help my grandmother in the garden at times, picking fruits or vegetables. My grandfather also managed a very large cornfield. They were farmers, very old-fashioned, as I said, They even collected walnuts and had a walnut cracking machine they would dump the walnuts into. I really enjoyed being at the farmhouse, and my grandfather was the best man I knew at the time. He was my best friend. I put him on a very high pedestal. Even the idea of ever disappointing him would sicken me. I couldn't bear it. So, when my grandfather died, it was tragic, to say the least. Now, when I got to my siblings, it was noticed that I wasn't as shaken as they were. They didn't understand why I wasn't more upset, but the truth was, I'd already had more time to process this than they did, because I had already known. I did tell my mom about the feeling, and she just patted my shoulder and said, sometimes when you have a close connection with someone, you can just feel their energy when it goes. I didn't think much more about this. My mom wasn't into divination. Things like psychic premonitions and tarot, Ouija, all of that were tools of the devil. So she never encouraged me to flourish in my gifts. I think it was less than a week later. I was lying in bed and I awoke to see a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It took a moment for me to get my eyes to focus in the dark. I had just woken and I was tired still. I remember rubbing my eyes, trying to get the sleep out of them. When I realized what I was looking at, I was extremely shocked. What I saw was an apparition of my grandfather. He was standing at the foot of my bed, just looking down at me, smiling. I didn't feel frightened. Well, I suppose a little. But I didn't feel threatened, I'll say. I didn't feel like I was in any danger, but it is quite startling to see your grandfather standing at the end of your bed in the middle of the night. After what seemed like quite a while, I finally sat up and kind of smiled. I felt good. I wanted to say something to my grandfather, but I couldn't think of what to say. He patted the foot of my bed, turned, and walked through my bedroom wall. I just kind of laid down, figuring that everything was okay. I just had this feeling of peace that had come over me. It just made me feel like everything would be okay. The next day when I went down for breakfast, I told my mom about it. She said it must have been my grandfather and that he was now my guardian angel. And that there was nothing to fear. Well, don't have to tell me what I don't already know. I was well aware there was nothing to fear. That was the last time, actually, that I saw my grandfather. Fast forward years later, though. We're in a different house. No, actually, it was the same one. Anyway, we're living in the same house. My mom had inherited 2 chairs from my grandparents when they had both passed. A recliner that belonged to my great-grandfather, and a recliner that belonged to my great-grandmother. Now, just so you know, at this point in my story, my great-grandmother is deceased. She died after a bout with dementia. I didn't have any weird feelings or visions when she passed, just when my great-grandfather passed. Now, back to the current moment in the story. My grandmother on my father's side, yes, my grandmother, not my great-grandmother, had been dealing with cancer for quite some time. And we knew that it was slowly getting worse. I was sitting in my great-grandfather's recliner when all of a sudden this cold, dark feeling came over me. And everything in the room seemed to dim. It was like a dark veil was slowly being pulled down over my face. It didn't completely block everything out. Not all the light was gone, but everything was dim. The atmosphere didn't feel right. I got a horrible feeling, almost sickening. And all at once, the thought of my grandmother popped in my head, and I knew. And I jumped up from the recliner, ran to, well, the kitchen. I think you're starting to see a theme. Kitchen was where the adults like to hang out the most. Anyway, I run into the kitchen and I tell my mom, we need to call Grandpa right now. She sees my face and is very perplexed, but knows the situation and is aware that I sometimes am aware of things that happen before others. So she kind of, I won't say freaks, but gets spooked. She picks up the phone, and just as she's getting ready to dial, my grandfather calls. It turned out that my grandmother's cancer had come back and had gotten severe. The doctors said there wasn't much time left for her. They moved her to a hospice home where she could be cared for and kept comfortable until the end. When my mom heard this news, she looked at me terrified. She really couldn't figure out how I had known. Again, she believes in this stuff, but for the most part isn't into it and thinks most of it really comes from the devil. I wasn't sure if she was now frightened of me or what, but she packed us up and we went to the hospice home that night, and we all got to take turns saying goodbye to Grandma. I was sitting on a couch in a lobby area with my siblings trying to console them as best I could. I wasn't myself very good with emotional things. I didn't cry at funerals. I didn't really cry at all. Not even when I was the most sad. So, comforting two crying younger siblings, a little bit challenging. But I also felt like I had to be strong and stoic for their sake. All of a sudden, I got another feeling, sort of a tingling in my body, and I looked up and said, "It's done." My mother went back to the room, and sure enough, my grandmother had passed right that moment. It was said that in her very last moments, she started looking around the room and conversing with past relatives. She had seen our ancestors. Now, I know that sounds cheesy because that's in so many other ghost stories and stories of people's last moments. With so many accounts of loved ones speaking to past ancestors, maybe, just maybe, there's something to it. After that particular incident, I did decide to start researching and learning more about my gifts secretly. I didn't want my mother to know. She would not have approved. But I knew there was something to this, and I didn't feel like it was of the devil. So I had to know more. Now I think that's where we're going to leave off for this particular video. As I've said, I've got quite a few stories though, and that shall not be the last I share. If you actually watched this video, I hope you did enjoy it. If you're interested in my next video, which will likely be the same thing, feel free to subscribe. And if you do, and you keep checking out my channel, well, I'll see you next time.